Greetings, it is I, Tantus Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue our discussion on the Pathfinder role-playing game system. When we last left off, I was talking about the environments your characters can explore, especially out in the wilderness of the world. Today, I'm going to continue where we left off with deserts. I was talking about their features. Well, we have dense rubble that you can encounter. Lots of, thicker, bigger rocks. It can happen in, especially more of a rocky desert, but it can occur in some of the other ones. When you're entering this area, each square is worth 2 squares of normal movement. Acrobatics, you get -5 to any checks when attempting it in this area. And stealth is at a -2 penalty, so it makes it a little bit more difficult for acrobatics and a little bit more difficult for stealth. Now, in sandy deserts, you can encounter sand dunes. These are, especially in areas where there's a lot of wind blowing, very severe wind, you find these giant kind of moving hills of sand that it can even move hundreds of feet in the course of a week. They will also cover hundreds of squares themselves in the area around these areas. So these massive dunes that you'd have to cross over. They're going to be a gentle slope on the wind side, the area that's the prevailing wind. And on the other side, it's going to be a steep slope. So it's almost, think of like this kind of crest where the sand kind of gets blown up and then drops off pretty steeply. Areas where there's a lot of constant wind are going to create these. Otherwise, they can't really exist in that kind of desert. You're just going to need that wind. Now, other features depend on the type of desert. If we're talking about a tundra, oftentimes there are forests near tundra, so trees occur. And especially in a tundra, you can find random trees. It's not an impossibility. They're going to be far and few between, but it might exist. In a rocky desert, there are stands of stone and mesas that might exist, areas that are kind of tall and flat-topped. They're going to be covered with cliffs on the sides or very steep slopes, but they will exist there. And in any desert area, you will find dried stream beds. Now, most of the time, these just function as trenches. If they should be filled with water, then of course, when the occasional rains occur, then they will swell with water and then be filled with that. But otherwise, they're just going to be dry trenches that are going to exist that are going to crisscross these desert areas. Now, sandy deserts can also have quicksand. The only difference between this and the quicksand that you might find in any other area is it's not water-based. It's going to be like an extra fine sand that exists in a certain area that creates an area of quicksand that you kind of just sink into. So it's a difference in the sand kind of grain which creates this problem. Now, when you're perceiving within a desert, traditionally you're going to be able to see about 66 times 20 feet away at maximum because of elevation and heat distortion. You tend not to be able to see any farther than that. On the other hand, if you're in an area that has sand dunes, it reduces it to 66 times 10 feet because of these changes in the elevation that make it more difficult to see. Because of the nature of deserts with very little cover and concealment, stealth is also incredibly difficult when you're talking about traveling within a desert. Now let's talk about sandstorms, because they are a hazard that can occur. Basically, storms that can occur that kick up so much sand it becomes a whirling, swirling mess of sand. When you're within one, it reduces your visibility to 1d10 times 5 feet at maximum, and you receive -4 to any perception check. Anyone that's unprotected that's out in amongst the sandstorm will take 1d3 points of non-lethal damage each hour automatically. Now, the other disadvantage is the sand gets everywhere. Every opening, every point where they can get in, it gets into all your gear, it gets in everything of you. It just gets everywhere and leaves a fine coat in everything. So that can actually do damage to equipment, especially if you shouldn't get sand in it. If you have an open jar or something, it's going to be filled with sand now. That's the problem, is that sand will get into everything no matter what you want it to or not. And getting into you can cause some serious kind of chafing, getting into your crevices of your limbs and stuff, and areas you just don't want sand. Now let's move on and talk about plains. Now, there are 3 categories of plains: farmlands, grasslands, and battlefields. The farmlands are exactly what it sounds. It's semi-settled areas where farmers may exist. Grasslands are the untamed wilds of a plain. Battlefields are a unique one because it's not a very common one, but it's one that PCs tend to actually encounter a lot more. It's the kind of place they go to. Whether this is very recent or old, it's a place where a major battle took place and the effects of it are on the landscape. Probably nature has been reclaiming it, but of course the effects are there. Now, of course, each of these has features, which has a percentage, just like any of the other terrains that you can look at the percentages. When we talk about the undergrowth in farmland, I do want to mention something special about it, because most of the time it's actually crops, which is highly seasonal. So you will actually see seasonal changes in farmlands very much more rapidly than anywhere else. In the other, like, untamed grassland, it's going to have, a certain level of grass that's going to maintain even if it gets snowy. At most, you'll be trudging through snow that's as deep as that grass. But let's talk about the features. We have light undergrowth. This is, of course, just the normal sort of undergrowth that exists in most places. It's the crops that you might be traveling through. It's the low-lying grass. It functions exactly the same way as it does in forests, except it's a lot more widespread in these areas. Granted, you can find areas without it, but you can find areas with plenty of light undergrowth. Now, the difference is when you get to heavy undergrowth, it does exist too. Those are thick bushes, kind of thorny bushes that could exist in areas, especially more in the wild areas. You will find that there might be like patches of heavy undergrowth. Again, it's not going to be nearly as common as the other types. In battlefields, you might find light rubble, where there might have been fortifications, buildings, structures, anything like that that got destroyed and left behind some rubble. You can find, I really hate you, light rubble. You can find trenches, especially on the battlefields that they've been dug in. These cost no extra movement to move into, but they would cost you 2 squares of movement to move out of. This might represent more irrigation dishes on farmlands or trenches for battles during actual battlefields. The irrigation ones might have water in them. Hard to say depending on the season you're in. Now, low walls provide some cover if you're next to them if you find one in a battlefield. There can also be berms, which are these kind of like gentle man-made sloping kind of hills. They could be just normally like about 10 feet across, wide, which then they have a gentle slope up like per square and a gentle slope down. You get the cover of a low wall if you're next to one of those. There are bigger berms in which you can be up to a square away from it and still get that cover bonus if you're sort of using it as a defensive thing. But again, it's just this sort of like little raise up. You can find fences, which are usually keeping things into pastures. They could be there for other reasons. They're basically separations. It costs you an extra square of movement to cross over a fence. A stone fence can actually be treated as a low wall if you're using it as a defensive thing and taking cover next to it. If you're mounted, you can attempt to cross it very quickly with a DC 15 ride check that won't break your mount stride. If you fail it, your mount keeps going, but you fall out of your saddle. So if you fail this check, you basically just fall out. Now, trees can dot sometimes the landscape there. This is more common, especially in the wilderness type areas, the grasslands. In places like Battlefield, they're more likely cut down. Farmland, it's hard to say. Battlefield, they were probably used for something, like making a siege weapon. Streams can also occur and dot the landscape. They're usually about 5 to 20 feet wide and 5 to 10 feet deep. You can perceive someone far enough away, about 66 times 40 feet away, but usually like features of the landscape will oftentimes make sure that it's a little more difficult to go beyond this distance in visual. And they might actually interfere with it if you would have a certain distance. Something in the way. Features are going to be there. Now, cover and concealment are not uncommon in this area. Traditionally, you're going to think about it that you're not going to have it right away, but something's going to be close at hand that you could easily move into cover and concealment. So you're not just moving with it, but it's not impossible to quickly go to it if need be. So that's it for today. I first finished up talking about deserts. I described the rest of the features that you might find within a desert, especially some of the more uncommon ones, and talked about sandstorms, which don't do a lot to you, but are more just annoying than anything. I moved in and talked all about plains and the 3 types of plains. I talked about the features you can have there, from the features of the farmland to the features of the battlefield, and the natural area in between. In the next episode, I'm going to move on and start talking all about aquatic terrains and traveling underwater or possibly above water, which will try to finish up our wilderness terrains that we were talking about. So if any questions, comments, anything you want to say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's just for the channel, the Empire, and the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you could always check out my Patreon, link description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.